In this first video of the beginner's course for Amazon Sumerian, we're going to look at how to create a new scene, as well as we're going to cover the general UI for Amazon Sumerian. So let's get started. We are currently looking at the dashboard for Amazon Sumerian. This is where you will see all of your scenes, past and present, and a couple templates that you can use to open up some new scenes. So let's cover this real quickly. Over here on the left-hand side, we have our home, drafts, and trash. And so if I want to open up scenes that I've used before, I can go to drafts and I'll get a list. I don't have any yet, and so I won't see any. As well as anything I've deleted will be in trash. But for the most part, what you'll see up here in these recent scene sections is scenes that you've worked on in the past. If you go to drafts, you will see everything you've worked on, and they will be logged chronologically. But if you just go to home, this will show scenes that you've worked on just somewhat recently. Below that are your options for templates. So if you want to open up a template, this is especially useful for augmented reality and also the default lighting scene. If you open up an empty scene or you just click create a new scene, that'll both give you an empty scene of which there is nothing in it except for a camera. So we are not going to do that, actually. We are going to start off this course by using the default lighting scene. And we will look at what the differences between an empty scene and a default lighting scene. There's not a lot. There's just a few things in a default lighting scene. So we will cover that in due time. So let's create a new scene with the default lighting template. I will click default lighting, and I will call it beginner's course. I'll just click create. Okay, so let's look here. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of my screen a little bit. All right, we are going to move from the top left and over, and we are going to cover all these different panels and buttons and menus and drop downs and everything. So up here in the top left-hand side is the scene drop-down menu. This gives you the option to open up a new scene, or start a new scene, open up an existing one. You can save it, even though it does auto-save every few seconds. You can save it if you want here manually. You can also duplicate a scene as well as publish a scene. Over here in the tools drop-down menu, this allows you to immediately go to your text editor, your state machine, or your timeline. These are editing tools within Sumerian, and we're not going to cover really any of those today or in this video. We will get to those in later videos. Except for the timeline. There are separate tutorials for that one specifically. This will not be covered in the course. However, there are tutorials to cover that. So that is the top left. Moving over, let's go to the other side. If you need help, you can, of course, hit the help drop-down menu. You can go to tutorials, the user guide, scripting API, and also joining us on Slack. And this is your account number and account ID, and so this is going to be reflect the account that you're using. All right, so that is the top bar, except for create entity and import assets. These are very, very common menus that you're going to use a lot in Sumerian, especially in this course. So if you click create entity, this will open up the create entity menu. The create entity menu has several primitive 2D shapes, a few others in that category, as well as lights and cameras. So let's quickly cover what those are. I'm going to go ahead and click, well, let's not do that. The 3D primitives, this has 3D shapes. So a box, a cone, a cylinder, a disc, a quad, a sphere, and also a torus. 2D shapes are, of course, just 2D, two-dimensional. Others category has an empty entity. An empty entity is essentially and we will look at this throughout this course. Empty entity is essentially an empty container that you can nest other entities in. So that's useful for grouping and nesting entities as a group. HTML 3D, that is HTML 3D entity that allows you to paste, or place, I should say, an HTML entity, but in 3D space. That is different from the HTML entity, which just it's an HTML overlay on top of your scene. This also allows you to add particles and a timeline. We will cover lights in a separate tutorial in this course or series. However, I'll briefly describe lights. A point light will mostly reflect a light bulb, so it'll emit light in all directions. Directional light will act like sunlight or moonlight. It'll be a light source that is essentially, in practice, infinitely far away from your scene, and a spotlight acts like a spotlight or a flashlight. Cameras. There are 4 different camera types. There's orbit, fly, fixed, and 2D. An orbit camera is a camera that will orbit around a center point in your scene, and that is the default camera. So if you look over here in default camera, over here in your entities panel, that is the type, is a orbit cam. Fly cam allows you to, when in play mode, allows you to control it using your keyboard. And fixed cam is exactly what it sounds like. It is fixed. It does not move when you are in play mode. And a 2D cam is an orthographic camera with a 2D pan rotational control. If you think about Sims or those types of games, that's what a 2D cam looks like. Just to be clear, the orbit cam is the default camera both for the editing mode and also in your play mode. But it is the only your editing camera will always operate as an orbit cam, so that cannot be changed. But you can change the camera types for play mode. So that covers the create entity menu. I'll close that. And then I'll click on the Import Assets button. This will open up our assets library, which this is where you can find hosts as well as a few different pieces of furniture and some other important assets, songs here. And also the Sky Sphere pack, we're going to look at that. So that's a pack full of Sky Spheres to add as a background. So these are very, very useful for a lot of other tutorials. And so make sure you check this out, check out this library, check out other tutorials too, and see how many of these assets are used. I am not going to be adding any assets at the moment, so I'll just go ahead and cancel. Let's look at the Entities panel. The Entities panel is the panel that will contain everything that is in your scene. The top level entity is the beginner's course, and so this is our scene level entity. So when I have this selected, I get unique components over here in the inspector panel. So the inspector panel, though it doesn't say it, is this panel over here on the right, and this will change based on what you have selected in your entities panel. So if I select default camera, I get different components. And one of the important ones being I have a camera component. Default lights, this is actually a empty entity, and if I expand this, now I can actually select the actual lights in my scene. If I select these different directional light types, these lights have, unsurprisingly, a light component. So again, the inspector panel changes based on what you have selected over here in the entities panel. So let's click the top level entity, which is always going to be, it's going to carry the same name as your course. And so this covers everything that is in your scene. So if I select this, I of course have the name of my scene. If I select that, I can change it right here. So if I change it, this will be reflected over here in the entities panel as well as on our dashboard. I can add descriptions to my scene. This gives me different information, metadata about my scene. I can click AWS configuration and add a Cognito identity pool here if I want to connect with other AWS services. Snapshots allows us to take essentially snapshots and versions that we can return to down the road as we're building our scene. Environment is an important one that we'll cover shortly. This has to do with your background, your sky sphere, and a few other things. And scene size and scene stats, you can select those to understand, get some metrics about your scene. So that is the top level entity. Everything else in our entities panel will reflect, again, differently based on what is selected. One thing to note is that everything in our scene, every entity in our scene will always have this top tab, and if you select that, this is kind of the description tab or the metadata tab, and so I can change the name of a entity if I want. So similar to how I changed the name of the scene itself, if I select the top tab for anything inside of our scene, I can change the name of that as well. So if I want this to be orbit cam, I can change it right there. Same for the lights. If I want to change the light type, I can change the name right here. However, one thing to note is that every entity in your scene will always have a transform component. Transform component is where that entity lives in your space. So let's unfold that real quickly for this directional light. It'll always have a translation, which is the position of the entity in our scene. It'll always have 3 values for the rotation, So that is how it is rotated, and also the scale. And so if you change any of these values, this will change either the translation or position, change the rotation or scale of that entity. So that is the transform. Remember, every entity in your scene will always have a transform component. However, not everything is going to have a light component as well, and not everything is going to have a camera component or a script component. You can always add components, however, by clicking this add component, and this gives us a list of components, and we will cover these throughout the course, these different types, collider, geometry, a little bit, particles, not all of these will be covered, but some of them. Rigid body, speech, we will be using several of these throughout this course. And so that is one thing to know about the inspector panel, is that if you want to change values or properties about an entity or edit an entity, this is where oftentimes where you will go. So if I wanted to add a state machine and create a behavior for an entity, I would click add entity, go to state machine, add that state machine entity, then I would edit the values of the state machine behavior from that component over here in the inspector panel. As we go through, this will make a lot more sense. Down below the entities panel is the assets panel. This contains everything we have in our scene. So it may not be visible or added to the scene yet, but it will be. This is like a library of assets and entities and different file types that have been added to our scene. So right now we have a blue sky sphere and a sky sphere blue. So different types of asset types. We'll cover that shortly. Also, there's a filter strip up here. So if you want to filter down to textures or behaviors, skyboxes, JSON files, speeches, scripts, sounds, materials, skeletons, meshes, gesture maps, entities, or all, you can click these buttons up here to filter down to those different file types. We will use the assets panel a lot, and I'll give you a heads up that the assets panel, if you get comfortable with it, it'll make your workflow a lot easier and a lot faster. So that is the assets panel. Most of these things will be understood in due time as we start messing around with them. In the center, of course, is the canvas. The canvas is where we can see our scene in editor mode, and it's the biggest part of our UI and also the most interesting part. So let's cover some of the options we have up here above the canvas. Number one is we have these three different buttons. Remember how we were talking about how every entity had a transform? Well, let's click this directional light. Right now I have the transform handles selected by clicking this button. If I want to select the rotation, I can click this button, as well as the scale. So I can change all these values either by changing them manually over here in the transform component property values, or I can actually move them on my own by moving the handles in any direction I choose. This is the global space toggle. So this will switch an entity from its local values to the global values. And so you notice kind of how the handles change a little bit. The full shading drop-down menu, this allows you to look at your entities, whether in full shading, full frame, full plus wireframe or wireframe normals, flat, lit, and texture. This is not something we're going to be covering in this course. Moving on to the next, we have toggle skybox. You can turn that on and off. If I toggle off the skybox, I lose what we see in the background, which looks like a blue sky. I can also toggle on and off my grid. And so if I toggle that on and off, I will lose my grid. I like keeping the grid on because it gives you a frame of reference for what is happening in your scene. The next button will allow us to toggle on and off our post effects. The camera drop-down menu will allow you to switch to different camera types that are in your scene. We don't really have much else other than this editor camera, so we're not going to mess with that at the moment. And then these other buttons will allow you to will frame your entities that you have selected in your scene. I'll show you what that is real quickly. I'm going to go ahead and create entity and add a box. I have a box in the middle of my scene now. I can't see it, but if I either click this frame selection button, or what I commonly do is just hit the F key. Now I need to have the box selected. My camera will then frame that box in the middle of our canvas. So it zooms in on it. So that's one way you can quickly view certain entities in your scene by hitting that frame selection. or the F button. And let's see what else do we have here. If we want to enter play mode, we just press the play button. So entering play mode allows you to preview what is happening in your scene when it would be published. And there's not much happening in my scene now because all I have is a box. And there's no behaviors, there's no interactivity, nothing really happens. There's just a box. So I want to stop play mode. Oh, before I stop, just do notice that there are some slight differences in camera controls between editor mode and also play mode. Very, very slight, not much, but there are some differences. And so one thing to note between the camera controls for play mode and editor mode is I cannot select anything now when I'm in play mode. So where I was able to select this box and see the handles, I can't do that in play mode because this would be the live version of my scene. If I stop it, however, now I see those handles and now I can move it around because now I'm in editor mode, which means I can edit. Also, if you want to view your scene in VR, you can test that out by clicking the Enter VR button. And you do not necessarily need to be in play mode to make this work, but you do have to have a VR compatible web browser as well as a VR headset that's compatible, that is actually set up on your computer you were using. One thing I'll note about camera controls, let me move this box back. I'm hitting these undo buttons up here, undo, redo, and also duplicate. I didn't mention these, but if I want to duplicate that box, I can click the duplicate button. Now I have box 2, and now I have 2 boxes in my scene. So let's talk about the camera controls real quickly. Camera controls, I'm using a mouse, and so it'll be slightly different between a mouse and a trackpad. We do have documentation on that, and you can also adjust it if you'd like. So in orbit cam, remember we're in edit mode, so we are using an orbit cam. I'm orbiting around, right now I'm selected on this box 2, I'll zoom out, and I'm using my right mouse button. And notice that I'm orbiting around this box 2. Because I just selected it and then frame selected it, or framed it in the middle of my scene. So it's really dead center in my canvas, and as I move around, it's always kind of focused. That's the center point of my camera. If I want to pan up or down, left or right, I can hold the shift button and my left mouse button, and I can pan all around. Now notice that the box is not in the center of my scene. I've now offset that, and so my center point is, roughly right there. But if I want to refocus on that box, I can select it and hit the F key and then zoom out and refocus on that box. The play mode, let's enter play mode and see what the camera controls are like there. I orbit in the same way using my right mouse button. And then I pan in the same way by holding shift. But it does drift a little bit. That's one of the main things, the main differences between editing in play mode camera controls is that you can drift a bit. So notice that I can spin like this. That won't happen in editor mode. All right, so that covers the basics of the UI for Sumerian and the dashboard and how to create a new scene. In the next video, we're going to look a little bit more at how to add entities and mess with those transform components that we were discussing. So join us in the next video. Thanks.